Hello, my friends. Welcome to a brand new episode of the Christ and Coffee podcast, bringing the church together one coffee hour conversation at a time. Today, I have Joel Webb joining the podcast. He has a podcast of his own called the Pastor's Call Podcast. He interviews pastors and figures out how God called them into the ministry. He's recorded close to 40 episodes, and I'm excited to pick his brain on all the data he's gathered on what makes a pastor decide to join the ministry. This is one of the most common questions I get asked as a pastor. Why did you want to choose this profession? And there's a whole podcast dedicated to this question. And I think having for Joel joining the program to talk about his podcast, to talk about himself, and just to talk about life together. Good to see you, brother. How have you been?
Thanks so much for having me on. Things have been going really well. Just happy to be here and get to talk to you again. So
Yeah, thanks for having me on. It was a cool honor to just be on a podcast versus, hosting them. It's always different when
Mhm.
you're on the other end of the
Yeah,
conversation.
I'm getting that feeling now myself now too.
Yeah, no
So
pressure. Don't worry. Just be
yeah,
yourself.
yeah,
So what made you decide to just start interviewing pastors and figuring out
yeah.
how they got called into ministry? What was the seed of this idea?
Well, I myself I'm currently in the process moving towards ordination. I'm now in the Free Methodist Church, and we have a kind of a staged process, three levels before to get to full ordination. And I've even from a young age, I grew up in a pastor's home. So I've always been surrounded by pastoral ministry and, living in kind of that life in the bubble, in the ministry bubble. Um, but even from that young age, I've always felt that inclination or calling into pastoral ministry, and teaching as well. But I know being a pastor was definitely a part of that. And long story short, and maybe we'll get into some of that later. I'm now in this process within the Free Methodist Church for ordination, and one night I just couldn't get to sleep. I just started seminary. Things have been going really well, and I just couldn't get to sleep. And for a number of years, I've always had kind of technical multimedia skills, and I've always enjoyed doing it. And I'd always wanted to do like a podcast. When I was a kid in high school, I did like let's play of video games on YouTube and stuff, making content. But I wanted to do a podcast, and I just didn't know what it was supposed to be. Um, and one night I just couldn't sleep, and so I get up, I go into my office, and I sit down, and I just start typing. And about an hour later, I had basically what would now become the Pastor's Call podcast. Um, I figured, what I felt, and I'm gonna say it was in a way inspired by the Holy Spirit, because I couldn't get to sleep until I wrote everything down. What is it that other pastors have to share and teach? And not just, hey, this is pastoral ministry or this is how to be a pastor, but what does it actually mean to have a call to be a pastor? Um, especially in a day and age where so many pastors are burning out. Um, having that call, something that you can hold on to, is so important, knowing, no, this is what God has called me to do as part of his kingdom. And so for me, being in this process of pursuing pastoral ministry, being in seminary, it seemed to fit really well. Hey, why don't I start talking to pastors around me? Um, I have a great parachurch organization in the area where I live that connects me to a lot of pastors, and then over time, that's grown out to people like yourself, who I know as well. And so that's grown into me reaching out and talking to pastors from every denomination possible. I've talked to Presbyterians and Baptists and Pentecostals. I have an Anglican coming up in a couple weeks, and I haven't nailed anything down yet. I know I have a Roman Catholic priest in the pipeline as well, but having that broad spectrum of people across denominations, theological perspective, still found within Orthodox belief of Christianity. But what does that call look like to the pastoral ministry? Despite all of those differences, what has carried these people through their journeys to where they are today and into being pastors?
Has there been any common narratives between the callings, or are each story completely unique?
Well, It's kind of funny, the number of people who say there's a normal way of doing it and my story is not that. There's a lot more of those than you would think. Like here's the standard way in our organization to become a pastor. That was not my way. I've heard that quite a bit. Um, there was actually an interview that I just did. Somebody talked about when he was in school, he heard about the three ways that people feel a call into pastoral ministry. There's like the sudden lightning bolt,
Yeah.
something like Martin Luther esque, just boom, oh,
Like literally a
yeah,
lightning bolt.
yeah,
Yeah.
just like instantaneously, you get hit with it. There's also the idea of like a growing conviction over your life that you're called into ministry, and then third is just circumstances. Maybe the pastor died or leaves or something happened, and now you are now chosen or thrust into pastoral ministry. And I think those kind of three main ways kind of uh, cover kind of the ways that a lot of people are called into ministry. Um, for most of the people that I've talked to, it's usually that growing conviction over their life that they felt called into ministry. They've had a sense, whether they grew up in the church or not. Once they were saved, once they came to know Christ, over the course of their growth in their Christian walk, they began to feel this sense of calling. Oh, I this is what I'm supposed to do. This is what God is calling me to do, to be a pastor. And whether they're full time or bivocational or have different facets of things that they do alongside of that, that their calling has grown and developed with their maturity. So that's probably one of the main ones that I've seen. Not as much of the lightning bolt or the circumstantial ones, though I do know those stories as well. But that growing conviction definitely seems to be kind of one of the primary ways, at least to the pastors that I've talked to, and that's across denominations.
I like that framework a lot. I usually use that for people's conversions. Usually they have the Apostle Paul experience, or they have the Peter, the overtime, or that's
Mm-hmm.
just like kind of there from birth, like the John the Baptist. But
Mm-hmm.
but now there's this trend being like accidental Christians. People are just identifying with the principles and okay, this is what Christianity is about because of how the culture is kind of
Mm-hmm.
pivoting. But do you find that most people become a Christian first and then the call comes second, or sometimes it's a combined package too in your conversations?
Well, I think that there's an element of, we're all temperamentally kind of inclined towards different things.
Hmm.
So if someone's inclined to be a teacher or to be a leader, um, you know, they may have that calling within the church as well, but they're just as skilled in those ways outside of the church as well. Um, so I definitely believe that God creates us with those abilities to to do those things, regardless of where we're at. And then I think, all of our experiences that lead up to that point where we're then maybe found and recognize our need for Christ and follow him, and then recognize, oh, God is calling me to this ministry as well. I think it looks different for every individual because all of our own individual stories are so different.
Right, right,
No two-person's story is the same.
exactly.
Um, and I think that's reflected in the tapestry of stories of people that I've been honored to listen to and talk to, and continue to, hearing their calls into ministry. It's really a beautiful tapestry of God calling people, and people also responding.
And I love that because I know that if we could have a formula for this, whether it's someone's testimony or call into ministry, we turn it into a system. We worship a personal God who calls us by name,
Hmm.
and I love that about our faith because it is that every person will have a unique testimony or passion that God has placed in their life to pursue, and it's just great to just gather the stories and just be encouraged by them. I love the Methodist tradition of emphasis on testimony over knowledge sometimes, or just that Western bent of, an ounce of testimony is worth more than a ton of theology at times. Even though
Hmm.
I love theology, I think both need to
Yeah.
go hand in hand. Uh,
Hmm.
but that's really cool that you're just gathering these stories.
Hmm.
And you said your dad is a pastor. What was his call like?
Yeah, so my dad's currently not serving in a pastoral role, but
Okay.
he's from Central Ontario. was born and raised there on a dairy farm, and he got saved at 16. He grew up in a nominally Christian home, had gone to Sunday school a bit when he was a kid, but then as he grew older, just parents stopped going to church. And a lot of the churches in the day would have been the United Church of Canada, which would be the equivalent of the Presbyterian and United Methodist Church in the States. Um, but he got saved at 16. Um, and uh, he and for I think it was an element of kind of that growing conviction over his life. He had opportunities. He became one of the kids in high school who would read the Bible and pray every morning on the announcements. When that was still allowed in schools, and so even then, people would be calling him Preacher Paul and things like that. And so I think that the Lord sent situations his way that directed him towards that call to be a pastor. After high school, he then went to a small Bible college in Brockville, Ontario. That's no longer there. That was part of the Independent Holiness Church of Canada, which is within the Holiness Wesleyan stream of denominations. Um, and that's where he became a pastor in the church that I grew up in. It was a independent holiness church, and then they changed organizations in the 80s as the charismatic renewal was coming through a lot of churches. While in that particular move, a lot of people stayed in their denominations. There were some things going on in the independent holiness church, and so the local church there at Wooler chose to leave and joined a small independent Pentecostal organization outside of based out of Western New York. And that's the organization that I grew up in. That's where my dad met my mom, and then they married. And then I was raised in that small church in Ontario.
And then you said you kind of had this. What about your story then? So you're growing up in a pastor's home. Uh, when did you get saved? When did you start feeling this inclination that I need to do this as well?
Yeah. Yeah, so I got saved. I remember praying the prayer probably when I was 5 or 6 years old. Being very very young, um, and and then from there, even during that, it was a small church. And then in 2008, there was a lot of people that left. So it was very small at that point. So then it became, my dad preaching, my mom leading worship, I was playing piano, and my brother running the slides and the soundboard. So kind of the practical side of ministry from a young age, I've just been very involved with. Um, for the longest time, I really had this double life going on. I was one way at school, acting one way at school, and then looking good on Sundays with the people I knew. I got very good at the deception portion of things. While I certainly confessed, I didn't demonstrate the fruit of the Spirit in my life, and certainly wasn't walking in a way that demonstrated that I was a follower of Christ. Um, and that was like that through high school and my first year of college in Canada. Um, and that whole time, I still knew God was calling me. I just knew that He had inclined me with gifts that lended itself towards pastoral ministry and teaching and all of those things. And so, I was gonna go to the Bible school associated with the organization I grew up in. I was gonna go to the Bible school because that's what most people in our churches did. Um, even if they weren't going to be pastors, they would still go to the Bible school. But I knew, even as part of the pastoral kind of direction, I would still go do that schooling. Um, but while I was demonstrating and doing that, I was actually planning to basically run off to university because I wanted to be a history teacher.
Okay.
And so I was really going to plan on doing my own thing. And like I was even going to move in with the girl that I was dating with long distance and the whole 9 yards. Like, behind the scenes, my life was really a wreck. Um, a lot of stuff changed though. My parents ended up switching uh, with a missionary couple in Cameroon, West Africa. They had some medical things they had to take care of, so they came to take over the church. And my parents left to go to Africa. Now we were in college at that point. I was just doing a 1 year degree program or a 1 year certificate program. And then I was going to go off to this Bible school, but really I was planning to go off to university to study history. Um, we were going to go visit my parents at around Christmas time, but the opportunity came up to do so earlier in the summer instead. And really, that was the providence of God because when we went to go visit my parents in Africa, my mom had had a strong sense that Joel was to stay in Africa. My brother, I have a twin brother. He was gonna go home. He was gonna go, finish off his trades program. But she really had a strong sense that I needed to stay in Africa, and so I did. I don't know why. Um, it was God's providence. I now say Africa was my Jonah experience, because I was taken out of a decision making process and out of relationships that were leading me in a wrong path, and it turned me into a different direction.
So
Um,
so you grew up in Canada your whole life. Now
yep,
you're tossed into Cameroon. From Canada
yep,
to Cameroon.
Cameroon, and yeah,
Can you tell me more about Cameroon? Like I know about it like just from like
yeah.
soccer or something of
Yeah. Yeah,
those.
so growing up in Canada, Canada, for those who don't know, is a bilingual nation. English and French are the two official languages. So it's interesting, actually, in Cameroon, they're the only other bilingual English and French country in the world. The predominant population in Cameroon is French speaking, about 80%, and then about 20% are the Anglophone speakers. Cameroon originally had been a German colony in the 1880s in the scramble for Africa. And then at the end of World War One, Cameroon was split in two between the English and the French. So the smaller portion, which was next to Nigeria, was British controlled, and then the larger portion was French controlled. In the 60s, a lot of the African nations were gaining independence, and the Anglophone speaking part of Cameroon was given the option: you either join Nigeria, who they hated them, or join the French speakers. And well, they chose what they felt was the lesser of two evils at that time, and joined the Francophones to make the country of Cameroon. Um, and there's all sorts of issues that have gone on since then. There's still a lot of fighting going on in the country between the Anglophones and Francophones. When my parents left during COVID, it was basically a war zone where they were living. But so it's an Anglophone and Francophone speaking country.
What it
Um,
was the division more based on the language, or was there
it's
religious
based
turmoil or
it's
tribal?
basically it's linguistically between the Anglophones and Francophones. Cameroon was supposed to be a federalist system like the United States, but then over the course of a couple decades, the federal government, the main government of the nation, kind of usurped authority from the individual provinces. So they didn't allow them to have the same autonomy, and then a lot of the francophones have been trying to push hegemony over the anglophones and trying to, not send in any English speaking teachers, or not properly translating legitimate government documents into English and French, sending judges who only speak French and not English as well into English speaking areas. So there was this huge, a number of issues that built up over the years. That have been causing divisions, and then have cycled down into violence over the last decade now, roughly, a little less than a decade. But I was able to be there for a year. It was peaceful when I was there. My dad was teaching at a ministerial, training pastors, and the organization's called Full Gospel Mission, and it's a Pentecostal organization. But they are dedicated to unity between Anglophones and Francophones. So everything in the school was fully 50-50 bilingual. A lot of the churches as well within the denomination, if there's any people of the opposite speaking language, they have a translator, and everything's translated
Wow.
50-50. So despite the division in the culture, the church has stalwartly said, we are going to be united as believers. And so, yeah, so my parents were there for about 7.5 years. I only ended up being there for a year, though. Um, and then I came back to the States then to start my studies at ministerial school. But that was an amazing year to get to live overseas. When you go for short-term mission trips, you see the top of the iceberg of culture.
Yeah.
You see the food, the language, and all of those different things. But the longer you're in a country, you get to see the bottom part of culture. What is understood without being said,
Right.
without being spoken. And so getting to experience some of that, and just understanding, how do people of a totally different culture worship? They just have different cultural practices because they see the world differently than we do. Um, for anybody who teaches in Bible school, the moment you get to Leviticus, you're having to kind of explain what it means to cut up an animal. Well, in Africa, all you have to do is ask how many people have slaughtered a goat or a chicken, and everybody would have raised their hand because they would have done it within this last week. So there's a lot of much more cultural similarity actually between the culture of Scripture, and what you see in the living culture today in many parts of Africa. So it was just interesting navigating those dynamics and getting to see how that was lived out. So it was definitely a beneficial experience, even for me, and it will be for the rest of my life.
Amazing. So you were in Cameroon for this year, and then you kind of felt the inkling to kind of just pursue ministry at this point, or
Yeah, so even when I was there in Cameroon, I had never given up the idea. I knew God had still called me into ministry. He had pulled me from the stupid I was doing, and was putting me back on the right track. And so I was even doing Bible classes at the school there. We did fundraise. I started a computer lab and was teaching computer science to the students at the school there. But I was also taking all the theology classes. Um, and then as it came to the end, as it came up to a year, I felt like, no, I think it's time for me to go back to the States or back to North America. And I was going to go to the Bible school that I was originally saying I was going to go to. So we came back to North America. And then actually, I get back to North America. I'm going to get ready to start school. And my brother had just graduated. And now he goes and he lived with my parents in Cameroon for about 2 years. And that was his own time he needed, his own experience, and it was beneficial for him as well. Um, but during that time, then I started at the ministerial school associated with the church denomination I grew up in
what do you
in
mean
New
by
York.
ministerial school? I think I'm not familiar with
Yeah,
that term.
so they call it a ministerial institute. So it's a 2-year program that covers a lot of things related to ministry and theology and practical things related to ministry. For many in the organization that become pastors, they start out at that point, or even people just go there still just to get a grounding in their walk with Christ. Um, Even if they're not going to pursue ministry, they still want to be, even somebody who teaches at their home church, so they still go. They take 2 years of their time to go to the school, and get that grounding. And so that's where I went for 2 years. I concurrently did a bachelor's of theology. This organization has their own distance ed school based out of Florida. So it's not an accredited institution, but they still offer both undergrad and master's degrees in theology. Um, and so this was the organization I grew up in. I felt this is where I was going to be, even though they don't have like a path towards or ordination. It's not anything that they don't have anything laid out on how to become ordained. It kind of, I guess it just happens at some point. They're just like, "Oh, we feel like you're ready to be ordained or become a pastor," just kind of as the opportunity presents itself. It being a small organization, less than 30 churches in North America, a larger presence in some other countries around the world. So, a lot of the positions are filled and they stay filled for a long time.
Right.
um, and it was the only world I knew. It's a pretty insular culture within the churches and within the organization. So I really didn't see any opportunities outside, um, because that would have been seen as a compromise of my walk with Christ, to go elsewhere. Uh, so that's where I studied for 2 years, and then I moved to Michigan to be with family, to work, and to help out in the local church.
So you were pursuing ordination in the Free Methodists. What made you transition to that group?
Yeah.
And,
So
and then
yeah.
following up that question, most people who are called into ministry, do they end up just sitting with the tribe they got converted at or grew up in? Or do you think that most people go through this quest of trying to discover where they fit? Because when I was in seminary, the majority of people were non-denominational,
Mhm.
and like myself, they didn't feel like there was one denomination or one place that fit themselves. And it's kind of the struggle, I think, right now, um,
Yeah.
for where do I fit denominationally.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, so, and I want to be as charitable as I can be. I have many family members who are still inside the organization I grew up in, and friends, people that I love dearly. But unfortunately, the organization I'm from has a very unfortunately has a lot of toxic elements of its church culture and its leadership system. Um, Unfortunately, there's really not any solid accountability. Um, even like where decisions have been made by the local church board, and then the overarching board of the organization sweeps in and overturns those changes. Um, and so there's of a lot of unhealthy stuff going on. A lot of elements of toxic culture that take place. Again, to the point where I felt, if I was truly going to follow my ministry, follow my call into ministry, I had to do it within this organization. Because God wouldn't call me anywhere else because we have the goods.
Got it.
We have the truth. There's other people who believe in Jesus, but they don't know as deeply as we do, and they have all sorts of flaws and issues that preclude them from having the knowledge and revelation that we have.
Because
Um,
but you're painting about two different things here, but I think are so important because you
yeah.
have denominations that have governance systems,
Hmm.
and then you have theologies, and these are two different categories. You could have a
Yeah.
great organization that has great theology, but then
Hmm.
the institutional government system could be corrupted by,
Hmm.
or it could be a style where there's no checks and balances.
Yeah. Hmm.
So I get that. I think a lot of people
Yeah.
relate to that because
Yeah.
it's hard enough to find a place where it's theologically close
Hmm.
enough to me, and then there's another part with fit, and then something
Yeah.
you mentioned earlier about, are there going to be practically jobs here well, like
Yeah.
after I graduate? Because
Yeah.
uh,
Well,
so
and I had settled myself. I figured, well, I'll probably be a bivocational pastor. Because that's just
got it.
how a number of the pastors are in this organization. Um, no church is perfect.
Right.
I'm in the Free Methodist Church now. I love this denomination. I love their mission. I love their call. I love their vision for the kingdom of God, but they're not perfect.
Of
They're,
course.
there's, they're, they're not perfect at all. Unfortunately, the situation I was in, it was a combination of both faulty theology and poor leadership structure.
Got
So
it.
it was kind of the worst of two worlds. Um, and so it wasn't a good combination. If anybody had left in the past, it was because they got bitter. They chose not to follow um, counsel of the pastor, and so they just decided to do their own thing and not do what God was telling them to do, basically. So we basically need to cut them off. I don't have contact, with a lot of family to this point.
Wow.
Some family members, we still do communicate and talk, but it's different. Um, it's very, very different, unfortunately. The conversations, they're very surface level. We don't really talk about much when we do talk. Um, so that's kind of unfortunate. But um, so coming out of that, it was looking for. I didn't really know. There was a lot of church. I had a lot of church hurt, a lot of emotional hurt, a lot of emotion, like not spiritual disillusionment, but I just didn't know where I needed to go. And it wasn't until after that I realized I needed a place to go where I could heal. I had to find healing. And so my dad and I had actually got connected up with a pastor's prayer group that meets now where I live in Port Huron, Michigan. It's interdenominational. We have a spread of denominations that meet together every week. We actually meet in one of the conference rooms in our municipal office center, where our city government meets. They've been meeting there for almost a decade. And so my dad and I had gotten plugged into this prayer meeting before we even had left the church. Because my
So
parents,
it wasn't just you; it was also your family,
yeah, it was
your
also
immediate
my
family.
parents, my immediate families. Just for some context, my mom's dad, so my grandfather is the president of this organization that we left.
Okay.
And then my uncle is the local pastor of the church in this area. Um, but there was a lot of reasons that we had to leave. Um, and and
S-
so
So you find this prayer meeting
yeah, my dad and I
interdenominational.
find this prayer meeting interdenominational, and the biggest thing was that it was a community of believers who were loving us. So it was pastors, and we got plugged in, and they were people who were encouraging us, who were loving us. We were able to sit down with a number of these pastors and just kind of just spill,
Right.
just hear us, Um, and so my parents had spent some time visiting a number of the churches in the area. Um, but we started attending the church that my parents are now members at. It's a Wesleyan church in the area. Actually, the pastor there, him and I are good friends. His wife and my wife work together at the same school now. Um, and for me, that was a place of healing. Um, it was just a healthy culture. Um, you know, again, I love the people that I've known for years and years and years at the
Of
church
course.
that I was at. Um, but there was a lot of sickness spiritually there. And so we found a place of health, where I was able to heal. And then through that prayer meeting, pastor's prayer meeting, I got connected up. The local Free Methodist Church had been looking for a pastor to be in charge of worship, um, to lead worship every Sunday and run their worship team and do all of that. And they had been looking for somebody for like 6 years, which is interesting. It had been about as many years as I had been in the area. Um, and so the pastor and I sat down, we talked, and then I had a second meeting with him and the church board, and they brought me on the team. And so then I've been at Blue Water Free Methodist since then, as a member of the staff in charge of worship. And then soon after, I began my process towards ordination within the Free Methodist Church.
So what makes it free? What does it do to distinguish itself from the other Methodists?
Yeah, so the Free Methodist Church started in the early 1860s. The Wesleyan Church had split off of the Methodist Episcopal Church about 10 years before, and then so this is the 1860s, right before the Civil War. So one of the primary issues was still over the issue of slavery. The Methodist Episcopal Church, which eventually became the United Methodist Church, was pro-slavery for the most part. And there was a number of other issues going on in the denomination. So there was a pastor just outside of Buffalo, New York. His name was B.T. Roberts, and he really had gotten himself in hot water with local denominational leadership because he really started bringing back this message of holiness. He's basically saying our church is now in the same place that the Church of England was in when John Wesley came on the scene. Um, there was bishops and other denominational leadership who were also part of secret societies, who were then kind of making decisions in back rooms and then stopping people from trying to make changes that would bring reform to the Methodist Episcopal Church. Um, so so with Free Methodism, one of the key tenets is obviously freedom from slavery, because that was one of the primary issues that led to them separating. Free from secret societies. Our only allegiance is to Christ, and so if we're part of a secret society, our allegiance has to be to that organization above Christ. So no, so we're free from secret societies. You're free from having to pay for a pew. At the time, you could pay to own a section of a pew in the church, and then even if you weren't there, nobody could sit in those pews. Um, and so that became a primary element. You could not pay for a pew inside of a Free Methodist church. Another element is, basically free to follow the Spirit in worship. So there's this element that, not that there isn't any form of liturgy in the church, but there's more of an openness to maybe the Holy Spirit is going to move in our meetings, and we need to worship, following whatever the leading of the Spirit may be. As well, they're free for women to be pastors. So from very early on, there was a push. It didn't happen in B.T. Roberts' lifetime, but for a push to say women can be ordained and can be in ministry. So,
This is in
um,
1860.
yeah, this is in the 1860s.
Wow.
So, B.T. Roberts and a number of other pastors were actually kicked out of the Methodist Episcopal Church, and then they founded the Free Methodist Church. Within 40 years, they were across the entire country. And now the Free Methodist denomination is represented in every single inhabited continent in the world, and is continuing to grow as well. Um, so that's kind of the short form history and kind of some of the key tenets about the
What
starting of the Free
what
Methodist
makes it
Church.
distinct? So I mean, thank you for sharing the personal hurt and the season of recovery, because I think that's the future of bringing back so many people who've left the
Mhm,
church,
mhm,
just to have an experience that's a better version of church, or the true
mhm,
version of church, because that's the only solution. And just having this environment where you could be honest with other Christians and just heal,
mhm.
is severely so important, because if it's not there, then we can't pursue the calling.
Yeah.
I often feel like a lot of people use the church hurt as an excuse to stop being Christians or stop
Mhm.
being pastors, because there's a lot of it. So, what were some of the keys of the healing process for you?
Yeah. Well, one of the one of the things that my pastor said in a meeting, my parents and I were meeting with him, and one of the things he said was, "Your emotions are not wrong."
Okay. So just a lot.
Um,
Okay.
Understanding, your emotions are your emotions. Now we can let our emotions carry us away, and take us to places we don't need to be. Um, but the things that we're feeling are the things that we're feeling, and we can work through them. There's a reason why they're there. Um, and so that was a big thing to understand. The background I came from, the organization very much was suppress emotions and live by the spirit. Your emotions are going to lead you wrong. So, don't listen to them basically. And even if that's not what they say, I don't want to mischaracterize, but that's the practical walking out of that. Emotion, for worship, your emotions should not be involved as you worship. It's all the spirit, the spirit, the spirit, the spirit. Um, so understanding, our emotions are given to us by God for a reason. And so having those emotions, they're not wrong. But we need to be able to work through them. And also the ability to ask questions was big. In again, just comparing to the background I'm from, there were sometimes questions that you weren't allowed to ask. You were not allowed to question um, the sources of some of the things that were believed. So the founder of this organization, this small denomination, basically his books, he published a lot of books, and basically the things contained within the books you were basically not allowed to question because he was a man of God. He experienced these things and had visions of these things, and you're not allowed to question them. If you have an issue with them, you need to seek God until he changes your mind about it. Um, and that I began to realize that if there is something that you're not allowed to question, you really need to start questioning that thing. Because God wants us to question him because his
Right.
truth, his truth will stand firm. This idea of wrestling with God, even with Jacob as he wrestled with the angel of the Lord. There's an element where our faith is wrestling with those things and
Right.
asking those hard. God is not scared by our questions. Um, and if we don't ask those questions and we just kind of suppress them, it's going to come back later and it's going to really bite us in the butt because we're going to have unresolved things that we haven't allowed the Lord to work through in our hearts. So finding a place where I've been allowed to ask questions, question the things that I believed, um, because so much of what I believed was intertwined with what I was taught growing up and learned in Bible school and tied in with the culture of the organization. I had to ask myself, what do I actually believe? Why do I actually believe it? And I had to deconstruct and reconstruct at the same time. Seminary's been helping with that as well,
Great.
because it's a safe place to start fires, mentally and theologically, just to ask those questions where you can kind of play around with those ideas, just to come to the truth, because it really shows where your faith is grounded. So being able to ask those questions has been huge, and of course, being with family. Not everybody gets to have family with them that go through this.
Right.
Um, and so for me individually, it's been a huge huge help during this time is just processing with my family as well. For my mom, she's in her 50s. This has been her entire life up until a couple years ago. So as
Wow.
bad as it might have been for me, it's at least two times as worse for her, because this has been her entire life. So the ability to process through with family and just see how what God has been doing in our life, in my parents' lives too, just to see where they are now, and just to see the health, the thriving in their lives. There's a spark of joy in their life again that I haven't seen in a long time. So being able to do this with family has been huge.
That's amazing to hear. So there's this honesty with emotion, this honesty with doubt, and this ability
Hmm.
to process with close people
Yeah.
has been the key.
Yes.
And I
Yeah.
find that just from personal experience, if we're not honest with our emotion or with our questions,
Hmm.
the Holy Spirit doesn't like to show up in those situations.
Hmm. Yeah.
Um, so it's just beautiful to see this redemptive arc in your
Mhm.
family
Yeah.
and this call that is still there on your family and on your
Hmm.
life. And now you're doing this
Yeah.
ministry where you're just gathering stories. At the end of the day, you're still the historian you wanted to be. It's just you're a historian for
Yeah.
the kingdom, just
Yeah.
gathering people's stories.
And it's so much more fulfilling than I could have thought it was going to be. Yeah.
Just to wrap up here, any episodes or testimonies you heard so far that really stood out that that are just wanting to share?
Yeah, there's a lot of great stories. One of the episodes I'm actually looking forward to a lot that hasn't come out yet. It's recorded. It's actually an interview with my dad.
Oh wow.
Um, and so that's going to be coming out in a couple weeks. I think 3 or 4 weeks from the time of recording. So we're coming up on the end of June here. So it'll probably be coming out middle of July 2023 or so. Um, I'm looking forward to people hearing that. It took my dad a long time mentally to prepare for that episode. He just wasn't sure about it for a long time, and then he was finally like, "Okay, let's do this." He was ready to share because there was just there's something about wisdom gained through sorrow
Right.
that he's been able to grow and develop in. And just seeing how God is using him in the background I'm from, there was even a statement made in an um, by a family member of mine that basically said, oh well, my parents work at a grocery store, so they left our organization and now they're working at a grocery store. Like, look how great they're doing, you know. Well, it has been amazing to see the opportunities for the kingdom that my dad has had. My dad is in charge of receiving at a grocery store right now. Um, it has been amazing to see the opportunities for the kingdom that my dad has had working at that grocery store that he never would have had being a pastor at a church or being a missionary. And so this idea that, oh well, my parents Paul and Tam, they're no longer in the organization, so they're away from what God's calling them to be. Like, look at them, so they're the warning. If you leave, this is what's going to happen to you. They have no idea. They have no I that There's so much that has been missed out on because that is the perception. And it, and I'm to the point even for myself where it's like I'm not really angry anymore. I'm sad.
Yeah.
Because there's so much of the vision of the kingdom of God that's been missed out on. So I'm looking forward to that episode just to see the life and vibrancy in my dad's eyes and his voice about ministry. Um, one quick story that I found very funny. I had the opportunity to interview one of the bishops of the Free Methodist Church, and her name's Linda Adams, and it was a great conversation. I was so, you know, baffled that she was willing to come on, but had that interview with her. It was a great story, and she told a story early after she was ordained. She went to a church, and the act, and this was early. This was probably in the late '80s or so. And so there had already been women who were ordained, but there was still a lot of people who were culturally opposed to it in the Free Methodist Church. And so the pastor of that church was away, so they had invited her to speak. And the the deacon of the church comes up to introduce her, and he actually introduced her by saying, "Well, I guess if God could speak through Balaam's ass, now here's our preacher." You know,
Wow.
and it was just kind of a funny story. And then she was just able to still share gracefully and share her sermon for that day. But it was just it was just kind of a funny story. And then just to see where she is now, overseeing a worldwide global denomination that has reached in so many places. So that was just an interesting story to see. Even look at the big picture of how the church perceives a lot of things now, especially related to women in ministry and other things like that. So that was just an interesting story that always sticks out in my mind.
Wow. Wow. I know you kind of always ask your guests for book recommendations, so I want to conclude with my final
Oh
question.
yeah,
Any book recommendations you have
yeah,
for prospect future leaders in the church, or just
yeah,
Christians who you think that are valuable gems,
yeah. There's
or resources that helped you get out of kind of this toxic church
mm,
environment? Because
mhm.
you're not the only one. I really do
Yeah,
feel like this manifests itself in various forms,
yeah.
whether it's a local church with a healthy theological denomination, but locally it's
Mhm.
a power trip with the pastor.
Yeah.
There's many stories. I think that there's reasons why young people have left the church, and I think this
Yeah.
is half of the stories.
Yeah. Well, there's so many good books related to toxic Christianity and spiritual abuse. There's so many good books related to that, and that'd be a huge list. One of the ones that I've read most recently that was most helpful was called A Church Called Tove by Scott McKnight. It's a fairly recent book. He uses the Bill Hybels Church out in Chicago. That's kind of his main case study as part of this book because he attended there for over a decade.
Wow.
Um, and he develops this idea of tov is the Hebrew word for goodness. So like in the beginning, and then God created, and God said it was tov. And so he really builds this picture, not only of what a toxic and spiritually abusive church looks like, but then what does God intend for tov? Like what is the tov thing that the church can be? Um, so there's so many good recommendations for books, but that's one that impacted me the most, not just because it lays out and demonstrates the problem, but also it demonstrates an amazing biblically grounded solution. The church is called to be tov. So that's one recommendation, specifically related to church culture and toxic and church abuse and things like that. um, the other book, I'm not done it yet. I'm almost done, but it's called Surprised by Hope by N.T. Wright. Um, and if there's one thing I'd recommend, not just for people who want to be pastors, but if you're a believer who has a heart for the kingdom, the purpose of the church is to not save people that then get out of here. The purpose of the church is to transform the world. And
Right.
in Surprised by Hope, N.T. Wright lays this out so beautifully, how a lot of kind of Western evangelicalism has gotten it wrong, related to what is the mission of the church. It's not rapture, it's resurrection. Um, and so he really lays out the mission of the church, comparing it to how the first century church saw it, and then how do we actually walk that out in the 21st century, really living that mission, that call of the kingdom of God, to transform the world, to be prepared for resurrection. So that book for me personally has been huge. Just transformed how I've seen the things I do day to day life, to really make it for the kingdom of God. So those are my two top recommendations at this point. So
Awesome, brother. Thank you so much for sharing your story. Thank you for your podcast and ministry. And I know you're just getting started in the middle of seminary, so keep
yeah.
up the good work, brother. And I'm excited to see what the Lord's going to do, with not just you and your but your family's redemptive arc here. And it's a testimony for many to be encouraged and not to lose hope, and to hold on to the call in the midst of the difficult circumstances. Thank you,
Right.
everyone, for watching the Christ and Coffee podcast. Tune in next week for another brand new episode. Please like, subscribe, comment, share. Get this podcast on some algorithms in your the social media profile to help this podcast. I would greatly appreciate it. Once again, thank you, Joel, for your time. Have a great week, everyone. Stay caffeinated, my friends, and I'll see you next week.